All right, welcome to the first episode of Pundits at the Round Table, or of the Round Table. All right, messed up. Doesn't matter. The goal. So since it's the first episode, I'll try to go through what this podcast/videocast will be about. Essentially, the goal of it is to give people who are at least knowledgeable in a field their full platform, or as other people say, to let them stand on their soapbox. But this isn't going to be your your cheap news, cheap public radio news soapbox where I don't attack your soapbox. The goal is to let each pundit or sort of practitioner of the field explain their thoughts and their position on a particular political policy, and so maybe the direction it's going, the current state of it, and then and to get full context and full sort of explanation for what they mean about like a particular analysis, and then kind of move on from there. Um, Obviously, the guests are going to go back and forth. Maybe they'll end up enemies after this. Maybe they won't. That's not our investment on this show. Um, so I'm your host, Scott Tong. There's nothing about me that's important in politics. Um, One of my guests, well, we'll start with the blank box, and his name is Ben. Introduce yourself. What do you do?
Hey, I'm Ben Francis. I'm a Bucks. Um, so, let's see. I suppose quickly about me is I work for a political organization within Minnesota called Alliance for a Better Minnesota, which is it's the quickest way to say this. It's essentially a Democratic independent advocacy wing. It's not associated with the party in any way. Um, so yeah, I've approached transportation really from a really strong MN Minnesota angle, mostly because it's turning out to be a big issue within the urban area of this state,
Okay.
the Twin Cities.
Oh yeah. So what's your role within this organization?
I I am the what's my title? It changed recently. I am the technical director here, so I mostly deal with websites and coding and such like that. But seeing it as it is a political organization, I am supposed to have political opinions as well. So
Okay. And then the person who's not a boxer and actually has a face is Jesse Horowitz. Like, what's your training? Where do you come? Like, where are you trained from in perspective? And,
Okay.
what do you do?
So, going a little far back to college, I have kind of a background in economics, transportation, urban geography. I've worked a bit in industry with sort of like data and analytics. And currently, I'm in graduate school for interactive experience. So, but I still tend to keep sort of like a urban transportation focus on a lot of that. So things I've done recently is make things like interactive street signs. Right now, I'm working on a tool to sort of better estimate population density in sort of specific areas. So I'm kind of, I guess, focused on working with like the experience of transportation and how that gets delivered, I guess.
Sure. All right. So you guys have both kind of like did a little like foreshadowing, kind of like a movie to the topic of this first episode. Basically, today we're going to be talking about urban transportation, the development policies that these two people think should be kind of in going forward in the future, what the new policies for urban transportation development should be, kind of the model that they should use, what's been successful, what hasn't been successful, and just to kind of give clarity to our audience. Ben is kind of approaching this from Minnesota's perspective, the Twin Cities specifically. Obviously, to give more nuance to this, but the Twin Cities, for people who don't know, is kind of an emerging place of like new models of mass transit and a distinct need for mass transit because of the way that city is developed. Jesse is coming in from New York City, very old city, which has its own set of challenges and has famously very dirty subways, but also because it has a huge population density, it needs to continuously grow its mass transit. So it's just separate set of issues because Twin Cities has a newer set of like trains is the one most people think of. Twin Cities is newer trains. New York City has a very old system of the subways and trains, so it has different challenges. So now that that's out of the way, I'm going to start with kind of start with Ben and like his position on how urban transportation should develop. So yeah, go ahead, and then we will listen, or maybe not. I don't know. I can't control the other people.
All right. So, I suppose where I would like to start with sort of thinking about sort of analyzing my position here is one thing you have to realize about America and like the urban centers and transportation is that America's cities grew up in a time when the automobile was the primary form of transportation. So therefore, the way the city developed and spread and was built is very much so influenced by the car, which makes the act of changing the way the transportation systems within the city works, changing that off of the vehicle, very, very difficult because from a design perspective, if you look at the way most cities are designed, it's a freaking grid. It's, here's a street, couple thousand feet later, here's another street, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and that's great for cars. The problem that's if you're talking about a light density area, that's fine. But once you start to add more people into an area, that becomes extremely inefficient and very wasteful. You have a bunch of metal boxes sitting on roads, basically doing nothing. So, with that in mind, when we're building out public transit within sort of like this is within these cities that grew up in the car age, you have to look at, okay, how can we make, because right now the car is the number one way to get around in majority of cities in America. You have to look at how do we make public transit better, or trains or whatever, alternate forms of transportation better than the car. Because currently in Minnesota, in the Twin Cities, if you want to go anywhere outside of the downtown area, the car is what you want to do. There's a big extensive bus network, and they're building out some bus rapid transit lines, but efficiency standard, if you have a vehicle, you should use it if you're not going to the city. If you want to go to the city, there's of course you have parking, and that's the same issues that you have in other dense urban areas like New York. You don't want to drive in. I personally would not want to drive in the downtown New York because there's a lot of people there and a lot of cars, and you're going to be gridlocked most of the time. So, where am I going with this?
Okay, well,
so
yeah,
sure,
okay,
go ahead.
let's just like stop, like kind of break down exactly what you say. So if I'm understanding you correctly, your goal is to kind of approach it from sort of an engineering perspective to increase sort of to basically divert policy to focusing on increasing the quality of transit so that it can match sort of the performance of a car. And maybe that quality comes from the line design, the actual speed of which it comes, the reliability. Is that kind of what you're getting at from there?
Yeah, more or less. I can go on another line here, is that one flaw I see in a lot of transportation policies nowadays, and public transit specifically, is that they fall into the flaw that you build a bus line, right? And it goes up and down a really, really populous street. The problem with that bus line is that it's not going to be any faster than a car because it still uses the same roads as a car. Thus, if there's a lot of traffic, that bus is going to be just as slow as a car. In fact, slower because it has to stop at stops.
Yeah, go ahead, Jesse. Yeah, let's bring it.
I think this is a great this issue of like the bus in the same right of way is like a great point that we could talk about. So I just wanted to if you wanted to talk a bit extra about that.
All right. Well, actually, then we'll see. This is where my only relevance comes in. We'll break a little bit from the structure. Let's kind of flesh out. What are your thoughts on how the busing relates? Because kind of just give people a general overview. Buses are kind of the second most common form of transit. In most cities in America, you'll just see busing, not trains. The results are sort of mixed. I mean, some
are really good, some are bad.
Yeah, they tend to have good coverage, but yeah, they stop all the time. They're in the same roads as buses, so kind of before Jesse gets into it, New York City has had bus lanes that have had, I mean, you can get into this more, but they've had mixed results. Sometimes they're good, sometimes they don't seem to do anything. Yeah, so go ahead, Jesse. Like, kind of where do you think that would relate? Because busing is such a common solution or proposed solution in transit
Well,
options.
sorry. Yeah, I didn't mean to interrupt Ben earlier. Sorry if you were about to bring this up, but I think
That's fine. That's fine.
yeah, I just wanted to make sure we kept talking about this, but I think it's like the issue of buses sitting in traffic is sort of like one of the core issues of you can sort of like split that into like the core issues of transportation, or like the problem with transportation, which is we have we have certain things that like we only allow, for instance, like cars to use, right? And there's ideally designated. We've sort of sliced up our street into designated spaces, and in most places that's like cars, and if you're lucky, there's like a sidewalk, and that's like everything else that you could possibly want to do, sort of in public, right? Like unloading your truck, riding your bicycle. Like a variety of activities will take place on the sidewalk, but we have this notion that like the street is just for cars moving around or buses, right? And then, so if this brings in the issue of like bus lanes and bike lanes and every other kind of like carpool lanes and things like this, I find this conversation and topic really interesting because I don't know whether this is the solution, right? Like giving the bus a separate lane so that it doesn't have to fight with, sort of general traffic, or whether that's the problem, which is that we've sort of created these spaces that only one type of machine or use case can actually make use of. I'm curious. Yeah, sorry. I'm curious where you were going with the bus thing earlier. It does, Ben. So I guess I can.
Well, I mostly was pointing that as a common flaw in basically all busing systems throughout the country. I don't know how. I'm not sure on specifics of like other cities. It sounds like New York has designated lanes and has a system that can avoid traffic better? Question mark.
Yes and no. Yes and no.
Yeah.
Mostly
okay.
no, I would say.
Yeah. So in Minnesota, in the Twin Cities specifically, as far as our busing is concerned, basically all of the buses share the same roads as the cars. Right. We have a new. If my camera was working, a quote unquote, I'm doing air quotes here, bus rapid transit system, and it's like, oh, bus rapid transit, that's great. I personally think that branding is a lie because guess what? It uses the same roads as the car. The only thing that's different about it is that the bus is more high tech and the bus can control the lights if it wants to, but it still suffers from that same flaw. It uses the same roads as the car. There's only like one line, I think, that I've seen that uses a separate lane outside of there's some spots inside the downtown area that I haven't frequented, but there's the university shuttle that has this road built for it that like goes over the train tracks and avoids a bunch of stuff to get to the university from a housing district, and that's the only bus rapid transit system that does not use the road for some of it. So like
okay.
That's what I'm saying. Like that's sort of why I wanted to bring that up, because it's a big flaw across the country.
Yeah, and it is probably the most ubiquitous form of transportation that isn't the car, in the United States at least.
Totally.
Okay, so then kind of bringing that back. So Ben, you were mostly focused on before we kind of discussed the nature of the bus. You were kind of working through kind of your ideas on improving sort of the quality of transportation, and I think that's where your policy position is about, like improving the quality versus the car to kind of incentivize people to actually use public transit, because kind of a common criticism, and I think the nature of public transit is that it is traditionally slower because you have to stop at all these different stops because you're serving many people. So what are your like specific ideas other than like speed? Because you can only make it so fast at a certain point because you have to stop all the time. To incentivize these people to use public transit. I know a lot of the options are they tax cars heavily in some countries. Though there's like nice to not have to pay attention to your public transit. Some it's just the car is so inefficient. Like New York City kind of works on the subway a lot of the times because it's like impossible. Like you just don't want to drive. It's because it's super annoying. And then somehow because of the density, public transit is faster. So kind of where are you coming from that? Where do you want to see it go?
That is the $1 million question. How do you? It's because in the majority of so I'm looking at if you don't have to pull up a map right now, but essentially if you look at So you get the two downtown areas of St. Paul. You got the Minneapolis and St. Paul. They like to pretend they're different cities, but essentially it's the same city.
The Twin Cities are they do a lot of stuff to bring people in who don't necessarily know what the Twin Cities are. It's kind of weird, but if you don't know what the Twin Cities are, they're just two cities that are right next to each other in Minnesota, and they have a lot of interaction. They technically are separate cities, but the way they interact, it's close to the model of a mega city in many ways, except it's too small to be a mega city.
They have something of a shared government as well.
Yeah, exactly. So the interesting part that I'm sort of basing a lot of my policy off of is that little strip between the two downtown areas, the Mount Groveland area and the sort of what's north of me? Whatever the district north of it. It's like that area.
Yeah, there's a lot of space in between the two downtowns.
And it's there's not a lot of big buildings there. It's a lot of residential areas, but there's like shops scattered throughout, and that's really a lot of that sort of makeup of the city is a big problem for transit because most of those roads are 2-laners, 1-laners. And the car, and like that's what I was talking about earlier, that sort of design is perfect for a car. So because like there's not a lot of like usually you can get where you want but then when it's rush hour, it's murder because the main roads are completely congested.
Yeah, just kind of clarity to that point. Like there's a lot of 2-lane systems, but yeah, they just have not expanded with the population growth in the Twin Cities, which is another common issue people face. Just to kind of pull people into be thinking of like why would these major roads be crowded? It's kind of obvious, but with the population growth, these roads are very old and reflect a much lower population, and you can't make them bigger because you would just have to dig up people's property.
Exactly.
Well,
so
go ahead.
Go Jesse.
And that's sort of the issue. I would say like at this point. In the world, but particularly in the United States, like as you were mentioning earlier, like a lot of these cities were built or in many cases sort of like rebuilt during the auto era, which was, let's say, like about 70 years ago. And this is when we're sort of hitting that wall of like a lot of and this is a broader infrastructural problem, but it's particularly in transit. We've gotten to a point where the things we designed, they may have been designed very well, but they weren't designed to last this long and deal with a population growth like this. So congestion's become a problem, I think, in pretty much every major city in the country, particularly those with fast-growing populations. But also in older cities like New York has a terrible congestion problem. So this issue of like, how do we, increase capacity without, inconveniencing everyone or creating a huge disruption, or evicting people and using eminent domain a lot. None of these are politically popular options, but they kind of seem necessary. And I one of the frustrations I have in transportation is like, there doesn't seem to be a solution to this. Like, in New York, what we've done, we just finished a brand new subway line. And it's by mile, like in terms of, per mile of track, the most expensive transportation project in the world. It only added 3.5 stations to the system of over 150, or maybe around 140. But the issue there, the reason why it was so expensive was because they didn't want to make any compromises. They didn't want to tear up the street, which is how they built the subways originally, for very cheap. So they dig it really, really deep underground, which of course makes it very expensive. They dig these huge cavernous stations because, people want it to look. There's a variety of competing political factors here, but all of this adds up to is a really deep station that works. It's perfect. I'm very happy to have this brand new subway, but it's deeper underground, so it's a little bit inconvenient to get to, honestly. And then it was just so outrageously expensive that it inhibits. It really doesn't. It inhibits further expansion.
Yeah, the cost to the city is going to be so long in the future that we aren't going to be able to keep doing initiatives like this.
There's just no possible way. Like if we were to build what we need in terms of subway lines at that same cost, New York would have zero money. I mean, like we would all be completely broke, or so in debt that there would be never hope of paying it back. So I think this is true amongst a lot of different cities. Is like this political unwillingness to tear up a street or move housing. really does either lead to, a lack of infrastructure where we just don't have what we need and the roads are always congested, or we have an insanely expensive project that doesn't totally meet the goals anyway.
Sure.
That's been my frustration with transportation.
I would like to
Ben,
tag something on here real quick.
Mhm.
I'm trying to remember what exactly the line is called, but we had a similar debate going on right now in Minnesota. In fact, it was a huge election issue recently. It's the what was the line called?
All right, well, regardless of the line,
it's the Green Line extension. It's the same sort of problem that we're having there, where it's so much money, and it's less of like tear up streets because Minnesota, just the way it's built and where it's going, there's more space. But it's the same thing. It's extremely expensive to build this line. Anyway, continue.
Okay. Yeah. Well, I was just gonna kind of to wrap up kind of Ben's interjecting. I mean, mostly you've been talking about like improving the the nature of the way the infrastructure is functioning. So, whether it's roadways, the kind of speed to compensate for the high congestion, and then just the technology itself. Do you have any other kind of points? Where do you think we should go? Otherwise, we'll move on to laying out Jesse's points, and then we'll kind of double back to what I think is an interesting point about the insane costs of developing any new transit in an already established city. Do you have any other kind of things you want to lay out?
So points on technologies or specific things that I'm interested in seeing, or
no, I was talking to Ben because he was still laying out kind of his general philosophy on how to approach it. Do you have anything else you want to add, Ben?
Let me think here.
Right.
I would say outside of the I suppose I'll just reiterate that just the whole problem of how do you improve transit in these more spread out areas. It's that's something I'd like to go back to, but nothing more to add at this time.
Okay. So let's just go on to Jesse. You don't necessarily have to respond to Ben. Obviously, that's great if you can. But kind of where do you think that? Yeah. What do you think that the future transportation policies should look like? What should be the goal? How are we going to do them, etc.
Yeah. So I mentioned. So I think the big thing right now that a lot of people, or I think one of the big things right now is this issue that we were talking about of cost and disruption and expansion and how that works politically. Another thing though is that I find frustrating, and I don't really have basically I can't answer your question because as far as my feeling and as far as I've gleaned from reading things I can, piecing things together, I haven't seen someone with a really coherent view of what future transportation looks like. I think the self-driving car is something that a lot of people are focused on, and I think with good reason. There's a lot of really interesting things that enables, and there's a lot of really terrible problems that eliminates. But I guess in terms of what I would want, I think right now our and this is sort of my personal philosophy on this is that I think right now the way our transportation system works is similar to a noble person riding into town on a horse, which is that if somebody has a machine that lets them go faster and protect them from everyone around them, everyone else is supposed to get out of the way. And I think if you boil it down, what we really have is a transportation system where it's based on sort of threat and aggression. So the traffic light, right, attempts to mediate that, right? But we still know that vehicular deaths, pedestrian deaths, cyclist deaths, they happen all the time. They're incredibly common. And it's the most likely way for people my age to die would be in some auto-related accident. So I would really like to think of a way we could, and I think this is more possible with technologies like the self-driving car, where we don't have a transportation system that involves this sort of threat of being hit as the main incentive to follow. Because if I'm just an actor, right, I want to go and I want to get to my destination in as little time as possible, preferably without rain or snow falling on me. I don't know. There's a lot of considerations going on, but the primary goal is to get to my destination with a certain amount of speed, right? And the only thing that prevents me from crossing the street against the light, the only thing that prevents me from doing this is that I might be hit by something. And I don't know, that seems a little bit old-fashioned to me. I'd really like to have a system where you could simply choose to do what's in your best interest, and it wouldn't result in potential like horrible injury for someone else, right? Like the fact that we rely on someone to say, I'm going to not like accelerate through this yellow light, and then or like the fact that we're relying on sort of individual decision makers to think responsibly for the other person that they're not related to outside of their car. That seems old-fashioned to me, and it seems inherently dangerous. I don't think we're ever going to have a transportation system that's safe and efficient as long as we're relying on, anyone who gets in a car to basically be policing themselves.
Sure.
So that's kind of where I'm going. I guess you could phrase that as like, I'm for like the professionalization of transportation in some ways.
Sure. And I guess kind of my set of questions. Obviously, the automated car allows for basically. It doesn't solve the congestion problem because it gets kind of the theory is that it should be as close to solving the congestion problem as possible because there's still people, but
right.
But by basically not having to use road lights and stuff like that, you can enable, in a sense, if there was a fleet of cars that people just use, it is a form of mass transit, and it kind of solves all these little interesting problems, but obviously. Technology is expensive, and who's going to, how are we going to force people to do this and all of these things? But
well, I think right now we're all focused very much on the self-driving car because, as Ben said, like U.S. cities are totally built for the car and continue to be dominated by the car. Even as public transportation generally, I think is getting better. The car they're still building more highway lanes. They're still building more suburbs. So there's still net growth in sort of like vehicle use, I guess.
Personal vehicle use, which is obviously most associated with the car.
Right. And so I think right now we're focused on the self-driving car. But what I'm kind of excited for is I think like you see Uber right now, right? They're really interested in self-driving cars. They have, this basically a new technology that seems to be, in my opinion, I was reluctant to like embrace Uber because I prefer like New York City, whatever system we have, right? I assume it's better, but no, it's more efficient. It works, I think, generally speaking, better than ordinary cab service, and they're very focused on the self-driving car because they think that that's the way of really bringing down car ownership and then making people want to use these ride-sharing sort of taxi services as their primary mode of transportation.
Right, because it kind of fuses with the bus in a sense because it's like a shared transportation system, but it's smaller than a train. Trains tend to work better for really specific areas. Like Tokyo, for example, works kind of to lay other miles out. Tokyo works very well for trains because there's like everywhere super dense, and so they just have tons of trains. So basically, because there's a massive population, so you can just build a train everywhere, and then it's fine because you're not wasting that space, and it's going to be used. But kind of it's a bit more spread out. This kind of hybrid model enables sort of kind of the advantages of having a car, which is that you can go to a specific place, but obviously you want to bundle people together because having each individual person in a car is like the classic problem of congestion.
Right, and I think that's going to be the kind of funny thing is that I think once you start to see us kind of get over that, the initial sort of hill with self-driving cars and ride-sharing kind of applications, I think very quickly you're going to see Uber get into busing and start going after these like $15 bus from New York to Boston, or the bus that goes between the Twin Cities to Madison, Wisconsin, to Milwaukee and Chicago, right? Like that seems to me like once we have the self-driving car, once there isn't that component of like I want my own thing so much, or like this is my car kind of mentality. I think busing is going to become a lot more, first of all, efficient, right? If we can on the fly create new bus routes based on people's phones, right? We don't have to have fixed routes necessarily. If you just press a button and it says I want a bus, it could tell you to meet it somewhere else, right? So I think that'll be interesting. If I'm to back up for a second, I would say that another major thing that is worth understanding about United States transportation, and I would say transportation all over the world, is that but particularly in the United States, we have an issue of competing subsidies here. So, again, like I think the primary goal of transportation is one person is in a specific place and they want to be in another place by a certain time, right? And you can get there by hypothetically like by plane, by train, by car, by boat, helicopter, whatever, right? Maybe self-driving car. One of the I think challenges of sort of getting a cohesive vision of what transportation would look like is that those subsidies are all uneven and they subsidize very particular and bizarre things. For instance, like you generally speaking, like the roads that you drive your car on are paid through general taxes. So even though I don't really use the street road very much, I help pay for that. And somebody who drives all day long, they have a huge benefit there. Meanwhile, public transportation also gets a subsidy. It's hard to say if buses are getting a big subsidy or rail is getting the bigger subsidy or what's going on there. But the point is that in an environment where you are creating sort of like incentives for people to use one thing over another financially, we have this sort of distortion happening where I'm always going to choose the option that suits my goals for as little cost as possible, right? But the cost has no bearing on the reality of like how much did that road how much did that road cost to build, and how many people does it actually move, right? If I'm not being charged to use the road for the road that for the amount of road I use, my use of it has no bearing on the ability of the government to build roads. It has no bearing on the cost of that construction, and so I don't really react to that sort of resource constraint. In the same way, the New York City subway is completely overcrowded, and one solution to that is to build more subway lines, which is, I think would be my preference, and I think a lot of people's preference. But alternatively, you could just raise the price, and a lot of people wouldn't be able to ride it, but it would be a lot more comfortable for the people that do. But of course, there's a lot of reasons why you wouldn't want to do that. There's a lot of reasons why they don't do that. But that's another subsidy issue, right? Like people aren't really paying the cost of how much it takes to ride the subway, which is why, the agency is almost bankrupt, even though they get a lot of subsidies. But at the same time, like a lot of our roads are deficient. But there's no, and there are agencies that are allegedly in charge of this, but they don't get politicized in the same way that public transportation does. So.
Sure. I guess kind of to sort of, do you have any additional points on your overall view, that you want to articulate?
Yeah, I guess to summarize, I would say that we have sort of a confusing lay of the land because of these competing kind of subsidies for different types of transit. I'm not sure what the future looks like. I know that self-driving cars is going to be a big part of that, no matter what, no matter how these subsidies kind of work out. There's just a very strong, compelling case for them. But that I also think that we need to have a conversation about what kind of rights do you have to getting somewhere faster than somebody else. I think that like just being in a machine that's dangerous to other people doesn't entitle you to move faster than them. So that's sort of my like personal philosophical bend to that, which is interested in how transportation can be sort of less like aggressive and less based on that kind of thing.
Okay. All right, so I guess kind of as our first discussion topic, I heard both of you basically mention that in some way the quality of transit is going to be kind of reflect its draw because you have to get people to use it. Like you can make this amazing public transit, but if nobody uses it, then it doesn't really matter. So just kind of talking about from the subsidy angle, I guess I kind of wrote Ben back in. What do you like? Not only what do you think of this, like how the subsidies should be adjusted? Because obviously you can kind of debate the numbers, but that's not super important. Well, maybe to some people it's super important, but I don't think it's so. But the idea of, because we do use subsidies for a ton of things, where do you think that the subsidy model should go, and how do you think, like, and what's not only like where do you think it should go? So like who should be getting what percentage of the subsidies, but essentially, is this politically viable? How can you make these adjustments? And I'll kind of brought both of you into this. So let's start with you, Ben.
Oh, geez, that's quite a question. Okay, so I'm not 100%. Okay, so I want to as far as subsidies and how do you pay for transit is concerned. So I know Jesse said I was asking about buses versus rail versus what gets what subsidy. I know in the St. Paul, Minneapolis area, the buses, rail, all that stuff, it's all under the same organization, and it's all one thing. So the subsidies that go to the buses and the rail, there's projects that you get funding for from the government, but those are separate things. Just like you'd need money from the government to buy more buses. It's all goes through the same government organization. But as far as the subsidies are concerned, so Jesse mentioned that keeping our roads up to date and from collapsing like a bridge in Twin Cities area did a while ago, that money all comes from the general fund, whereas public transit is completely different. And I think that sort of runs on an assumption that's been prevalent throughout America, sort of bringing it back to where I started, is that it assumes that everyone in the United States owns a car and uses a car, which is less and less the case. Me personally, I own a vehicle and I pay for a garage. But really, if I use my car for getting groceries and that's it, and going to doctor's appointments. Everything else I use the rail because I'm lucky enough to live a half a mile from the nice green line that runs between the two metro areas. It would be so it's actually more politically viable, in my opinion. It's more politically viable to sort of switch the funding model for public transit than you'd think, because that's super boring and no one cares about it.
Sure.
Right.
So you could say
exciting issue to most people. They just don't like it when it doesn't work. It's the only time you ever hear about it.
It's we're just using general taxes from the sort of greater metropolitan area to fund public transit, and people will just be like, "Wait, what?" It's like I don't know. What do you want to say about it? Because personally, personally from where funding should come from, I think that public transit should be at least in some much cheaper than it is already. I know it's subsidized as it is, but I still see people when I take the rail saying, "Hey, do you have 50 cents for a ticket?" And I'm just like, why are we forcing people to pay for a service to get around to get around the city? Because their only other option is to have a car, which, oh my God, owning a car is really expensive, and we should not expect everyone who lives in America to own a car. People who basically are working to make ends meet every day. We shouldn't expect them to buy and maintain a car, because that is a huge drain on finances.
Yeah.
So
go ahead. You have another point.
No, I was just I feel like I'm wandering a little bit. Go ahead and draw me back into where you want me to be.
So, A, before I pull Jesse in, and B, before our lovely Southern viewers scream that this is just socialist propaganda, that we shouldn't have to pay for transit, they actually sort of to kind of draw on broader ideas. By limiting people's access to transportation, there's a good deal of theory that says kind of limit labor mobility, which is not what cities want. In more rural areas, this is a bit different, but in cities, you don't want to limit your labor market and where they can move around, because it creates it's a bit beyond the scope, but just to give people an idea of why someone would ever say that, is because it creates all sort of economic problems of impoverished areas, lower social mobility, and just things that cities generally don't desire, and just most countries don't desire. So kind of just to throw the theory behind why that is before you just scream that, in the comments section, that we're just a bunch of socialist sellouts who are trying to make America fail. And Jesse, so do you have any real thoughts on that? Before?
Actually, can I just want to add something, Scott, real quick. As far as the worker mobility, that argument you just made is a big argument why they want the rail extension in Minneapolis, because there was a study done that said hey, unemployed people are here. There's jobs over here. We can build a line to connect them. Sure. So,
kind of.
So it is a real thing, basically. Yeah, that's what I'm saying.
So that I completely. I mean, that is a real thing, and I think that's the goal of transit, right? Is to connect people who need jobs or whatever is over there to that place, right? I will say this though. So I think it is a little bit interesting, and I agree. Like I'm very much a fan of sort of like low cost, high access transportation, basically. But I would say that like it's something worth considering. Maybe here, but maybe just people in general should think about. We do seem to have this value that transportation should be cheap, and I feel that way. But I think it is worth sort of sometimes like questioning that feeling, which is that, and because I think that's kind of how we got to where we are today, where we built these cities so around the automobile, with the kind of intention, and the reason why we pay for cars out of the general fund, and the reason why we pay for transit out of a separate fund. I think a lot of that goes back to we have this idea, or at least politicians have this idea that transportation should be cheap, and I don't know if that's necessary. I don't know where that value comes from, but I definitely perceive it both in myself and generally when talking to people about transportation. I think we start with that assumption, and I don't know if that, and I think it can sometimes take us to dangerous places. I will say though that I think that, so we talked a bit, or Ben was mentioning how we could maybe fix that financing issue. But one concern I would have there, I tend to focus on that kind of aspect of it a little bit, maybe too much, the sort of political economic aspect. But the concern I would have here is that if you tried to put road construction, rail construction, sort of bus support, things like that, all on the same sort of funding schedule, basically, my concern is that we would either see people would either totally freak out at how much the roads actually cost. I think we've done a good job at burying that fact, and if we had to somehow account for like roads or like transportation spending, for cars, and then transportation spending on public transit, we would see something funny, because like part of the subsidy that cars are getting isn't just that we pay for the roads and don't charge people always to use them. It's also what we don't price. So like gasoline, for instance, right, has like a different tax deal than most other goods and services we buy, right? I would say generally economists and transportation experts would agree that we really need to raise the gas tax. Gasoline obviously burns and turns into carbon dioxide, carbon monoxide, and a whole other, group of things that we don't necessarily want to be breathing. The road, cars that use the gasoline are putting wear on that road, right? So originally the gas tax was meant to sort of finance the road construction and things like that. It was meant to be self-contained, but it's not politically popular. And I think that is because we have this sort of unquestioned value of transportation should be cheap. And for, probably 90% of people in this country, that means with a car and you burning gasoline. So I don't know.
Can I jump in here real quick?
Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead.
First, I muted my mic, but when you mentioned that we're bearing the cost of roads, I about cracked up on my end, because that's so true. People have no idea. But I don't know. One thing about the gas tax, though, is that one problem I have with that. I mean, logically, I understand. I'm right there with you. But the problem with the gas tax is that part of the problem is that it ends up sort of being a tax on the poor, because
it's really regressive.
Yeah, that's the one big problem I have with the gas tax, is because well, it's like a baseline cost that everyone has to foot. Like some people have more cars and drive more, but most of the time people are using the car to get to work and back. Like you have people who can take a car to go on trips, but whatever. Most of your gas costs is work and back. And if the poor have to pay that same cost that upper class people have to do, then they're going to feel that tax increased more. So,
right.
I don't know. That's just sort of a nuance I just wanted to point out here, that because raising the gas tax is like cool, but it's like there's problems with it.
Right. Okay. So kind of just to keep us all in line. And also, if the audience got lost, I don't know how you could possibly get lost in this, but raising taxes is never a popular political opinion, and the gas tax has not been raised since the 90s, I believe. Is that accurate?
Something like that, yeah.
And then it's used to pay
100%
for the
sure, yeah.
federal highway fund, which is like basically just how you pay for roads in the United States. And kind of just before Jesse gets into it, I want Jesse to respond, but also just kind of we do have a very big sort of divorce between public and private transportation and how to pay for that. Do you guys think that kind of merging the costs together as the idea that we have to be paying for transportation in general, and that would be like basically part of the United States budget. I mean, it already is, but like kind of converting it out of just instead of like specific taxes based for specific things, you would see the overall transportation budget, and then that would be a more clear way to sort of see what money the country has in the first place. But go ahead and respond to that Ben's point that there is sort of a problem with the gas tax raising, even though it probably is necessary. A lot of people think it's necessary.
Right. So regressive just as an explainer, but a regressive tax is one that tends to be more expensive proportionally for the poor, which is in opposition to a progressive tax structure, which is how our income tax works, where the more money you make, the higher the rate goes. So yes, raising the gas tax is certainly regressive. I would say that like probably you were asking sort of like the public versus the private, or whether this should all be one fund kind of thing. And so I think these are kind of related ideas about this regressive gas tax and whether or not this should all be paid for in the same way, which is, I think that people, so my answer is yes, it should all be paid for in the same way, which would mean that, my subway ride right now costs me $2.75 a ride. I know generally I have a vague idea that it should roughly cost double that if it's going to pay for itself with no sort of subsidy or anything going on. And my preference would be that, when you're driving your car, you're paying a fair gas tax. When you're taking the subway, you're paying the, cost of providing that service. And that it would be very efficient, but it would be very regressive. So I guess if you look at this, I guess people think about transportation along two lines, probably. One would be efficiency and one would be equity, right? And I think that maybe the disconnect is that with cars, people tend to value efficiency. Or I don't know, I actually shouldn't say that, because as we were just saying, the gas tax is very low, and that in some ways does act as an equalizer in terms of access to the roads. But my solution would be to, charge the efficient price, which is the price that it costs to provide if you're the government, or, the price that, if you're a private company maximizes your profit, right? You choose that price, and then the way you deal with the equity problem is you do something that like offers sort of like, here's a $100 check or a tax credit, right? That can be spent for transportation purposes. So my subway ride might cost let's say $5.50, which is a lot. I mean, like I would balk at that, and I'm certainly not one of the lowest income people in this city. But if I got a check every month that paid for half of that, it wouldn't be so bad. And the good news there would be that like if it was objectively better for me to drive somewhere, or more efficient for me to drive somewhere, I could do it and I could apply that subsidy. But if it was more efficient to take the train, I could do the same thing and apply the same subsidy. So that's sort of like that kind of model would be sort of a similar idea to like a basic income, but focused discreetly on transportation. I think that's sort of where I would like be happy.
Right. So that's towards addressing
efficiency. Yeah.
Right, towards addressing the kind of the lack of specificity when you pay taxes and like the subsidies to transit. I mean, people do it differently, and there is sort of like an individual nature that makes it very hard to account for in the policy perspective, because like you don't know how many and also when it's at a subsidy organizing level, I mean, someone's going to be unhappy inevitably. Which is right. Not fine for government, but it always happens. But by using tax credits, the goal is to kind of assuage that, because you can spend money however you want, basically.
Right.
Sure. Okay, so Ben, did you have another response back to
that?
That?
I mean, as far as charging it what it is, And like making a tax credit. Like, I mean, I understand where you're going with that. But personally, my opinion on this, because I think at the end of the day, if it's done right, we both would end up at the same spot as far as equity is concerned. But my preference is go the complete opposite direction that you did, that you went there, where you just lower prices on transit and such like that, and just and reflect that cost back into the tax code, and just push more money into the metro or whatever bus system, whatever, and just let people ride it for free, and it'll end up at the end of the day that the people who make more money will just have to pay more, and people who make less will end up paying less. But you don't, because part of the reason I want to go, I would like to see go that direction is because then it becomes so much easier to manage the system, manage the public transit system, because you don't have to have someone scan a card every time. You don't have to worry about losing a card. You just say, I'm going to take the train. I just walk onto the train. There's less policing involved, less infrastructure you need to do that, and less red tape. That's my take on it. I don't know if you want to respond to that at all, but like, well, I feel like I'm just on the opposite direction.
Just a direct response, because otherwise.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a totally valid option. I think what we have now is this kind of mush that's like neither here nor there, and kind of the worst of both worlds.
I will agree with you 100% on that.
Yeah, I think that one of the problems is like we have this competing. Certainly both equity and efficiency are important goals. We seem to be, and I would love to see transportation be used for honestly either purpose very well. But I don't know. Ben, I totally get where you're coming from, and honestly, would love to live in a city where that was the case. It's just what we have now, I think, is really the worst option. So.
Okay, so let's unpack that, because I guess just to give kind of starts off, New York City is weird in that the agencies that control a lot of things aren't the same agency. So it's like kind of there's sort of a weird disconnect, because they have to technically be in the black, but they never are. So there's all these criticisms levied at the MTA, but I forget who controls that other thing. Is that where you're coming at for why we have like the worst model? And so let's just say New York, but generally the country.
Okay, so the way it works in New York is. The state, so I think the way it works in most states is the states own the streets and the roads, most of the roads, and most of the highways, with some federal, interstates in there as well. The way public transit works in New York City is that it's basically, so the bridges, the tunnels, the subways, the commuter rail, the buses, and then sort of like some other like here and there kind of like connections are all run by this agency called the Metropolitan Transit Authority, which operates mostly in New York City, but also in a number of other towns. It goes all the way out through Long Island, which is a major New York suburb, all the way up north through Westchester, into parts of Connecticut, the neighboring state, and I think it even operates a little bit in New Jersey. And the big problem we have with this agency is that it's not held accountable well. There's a huge incentive for corruption, and it's just not responsive to the public. So it's with the Second Avenue subway they just built. This was like a major project. Again, it was extremely expensive, and part of this is because, again, being a state agency, it doesn't have to take the city's best interests into consideration necessarily. It kind of takes the broader agency's interest in consideration, and that reflects the political ambitions of the governor, who again is not elected only by the city. So is it a problem when they do something incredibly expensive that is like less useful than it could be? Yeah, and like it's. I think that's generally what we have, is that when we build and this is, I think, again, true across the country, when we build, a huge highway interchange, it's more expensive than it needs to be. and it's not going to move as many people as they think. And I think that's been, or it's never going to be at a comfortable capacity. We have this problem where the bigger the highways we build, the more people decide to drive on them. The more subway lines we build, the more people go into the subway system. So yeah, I don't know. I'm getting a little bit lost here, but like I think this big agency problem is part of it. Like we haven't enabled people to say like, do we need this high? Like I think the
idea of need isn't fully accountable. Like we don't. Like people will always say we want more highways or we need more highways, but that actually doesn't necessarily. I mean, it's a public opinion, but there's not necessarily the research to indicate what is the best use of infrastructure spending and what to develop in the future. Basically, is that what you're kind of getting at?
Yeah, I guess. Yeah, and I could rephrase it in that basically there's no market for transportation. We use markets for almost every other aspect of our economy. Like food, right? There's the prices of your avocados is going to go up or down depending on how much.
It's inherently tied to the principle of trade.
Right. How many people are making it and how many people want it, that sorts out the price for the most part, That is not the way we fund transportation at all. And I don't think we use a logical system. So when I was saying like I think we have the worst option right now, and I was saying that I think Ben's system is valid. I think my idea for it is valid as well. Is that both of those sort of, in a certain sense, create a fairer market for this, or
they're giving you an actual like you have a way to evaluate how much things can cost, as opposed to and then you can have a direction of where to spend money, as opposed to just like kind of having to take public opinion, which isn't to say the public doesn't know what's going on, but it's not very scientific at that point. It's very hard to gauge what you should be spending. Exactly.
I think that like I think that we need a system of assigning value to a system. Yeah, we need like a fair system of assigning value to infrastructure projects as well as to sort of transportation services, and we don't have that right now.
Okay.
So whether you make it more market based, or you make it sort of more, I guess, sort of like public oriented, sort of making it, as like Ben was saying, is like a sort of a free sort of service that we just expect to be free, right? This model we have now of sort of saying like, okay, well, we want to build this subway line. How much money can we get from the federal government? How much money can we get from the state government? So we don't want to bother anyone on this block, so let's make it more expensive because it's easier to get money here. It's not really done. The way we build things is not really done in relationship to actual need or our ability to provide it. It's done mostly based on political decisions, and which I think
desire is usually the way to.
Yeah, or it's sort of like I don't know, like if kids, it's like, if kids ran the government, right, there would be a candy store on every block or something like that, right? And we kind of have that, except for like what more or less like wealthy suburbanites want, especially in the case that where the transportation is controlled by the state. So what we have is parking on every street and very meager transportation expansion.
Sure. So
I don't know. I think we need to make our method of allocating transportation less political, and whether that means assuming it's a sort of like a public right, like I have a right to be able to get to where I need to go, or saying that we charge it at cost. I think both of those are valid options, but I think it just simply needs to be a less political decision because we've gotten too far away from actual value here.
Sure. Yeah. All right. Let me bring. Yeah, Ben. Do you have any?
I just want to jump in here. So, how do I phrase this? What was the phrase you said? We need a system of deciding how
assign value
to transportation that's less political. Mm-hmm. That's a really cool idea. The problem is, and this is actually a problem with every single goddamn government agency, pardon my French, is that if it's a government agency, it inherently answers to the politicians.
Right.
If say we wanted to say privatize any sort of metro or public transit or road system, terrible idea in my opinion as well. then unless you want to do that, it's going to end up being political in some way, because taxes are determined by politicians. How much you spend on government projects is decided by politicians.
Well,
and while I do agree with you that it's become very much polarized, where as the rest of our political system, but that's a whole other conversation. As much as we can say like we need to make it less political, but like inherently government organizations are political, and it's like less efficient because it is politics. And you could say, and you can argue that it shouldn't work that way, and I absolutely agree with you. But how do you get there? How do you get away from that politics? And I don't really see a way to do that outside of if, say,
privatizing
everyone, or just saying everyone agrees in this core value that transit should be a service that the government provides.
Right. Well,
if we all get there, then it'd just be a calculus.
Right.
How do we move the maximum number of people as far as possible, as quickly as possible.
Okay. Well, then, kind of before we jump to the next and last topic, to kind of propose an idea, I don't necessarily understand how or remember how the Fed works, but that is like a sort of, Jesse, you can answer this, but is it technically a private institution that is responsive to the government? So it isn't.
Yeah. It's a public. It's a really weird one, but it's essentially a private public partnership.
Right, and where I'm getting at with this is the Fed provides at least some context of a model where it's divorced from politics in some degree. Now, it's obviously not completely divorced from politics. I mean,
right.
And if anyone knows the housing market crisis of 2008, that's what the Fed just messed up horribly, to say the least. But that is a method by which, at least in some ways, it can remain aloof from from direct meddling, but obviously it's still held accountable to politicians. For example, like the Senate can't just release currency and stuff like that. And and so I'm going to throw this back to you two. But do you think having a model like that would kind of at least help transit move forward, because it is held accountable to politics? What you kind of do want is people like to complain like, oh, politics gets nothing done, but like that's the only place for discourse for how we want to do stuff in our government. Mm-hmm. Do you think a transportation department or a DOT that's more like that would work better in the future for developing stuff? Because it still can have its own agendas that aren't necessarily completely desire-based or sort of politically based, in the sense that like people want stuff, but it can also make calculations and where we should be going. What do you two think about this idea? Because obviously this is not my wheelhouse. I'll start with Ben and then we'll move to Jesse.
That's a very... You are presenting me with a road that is foggy, and I cannot see where the road leads.
Sure. Okay.
I feel like. All
right. Let
me. Yeah. Go to Jesse while I think about this for a moment.
Yeah. I think it's a really interesting comparison between the Fed and transportation. What I guess what I would take that to mean would be. And I don't. Ben said he's not a fan of privatizing things, and I would say that under our current circumstance, our current political environment, I agree that I am against privatizing public transit. But I guess what the Fed model would sort of imply is that, like, let's say, and I've kind of thought about this too in terms of like, because so the subway systems in New York used to be mostly three private companies. Competing with one another, and that's partially what led to how rapidly and expansive it is. And now, like, since those companies were basically collected into one public organization, we've had almost no subway construction. And so I think I do kind of see the merits in privatization in that respect. And I find the idea of like a Fed kind of thing interesting, because we do have, right now, we have things called like regional planning associations. There have been lots of attempts in the past to like create like non-political or like sort of separated political boards of directors or trustees that would sort of say, what does this region need? Like how, and like lay out plans for what it could look like, and it winds up just being kind of a suggestion that's almost never picked up. So we have a regional planning association or regional planning board for the New York metropolitan area, and they always put out. I mean, they put out great proposals, but they're totally
no one's required to listen to them.
Nobody's required to listen to them, and often their ideas are sort of like transit porn. It's like it's not like
it's too divorced from reality to be like a serious proposal in a sense.
Yeah, I mean, like, they make a compelling argument and they're right. It's just there's no money and will to do these things. Now, if they were able to issue these plans and said we need a subway line that runs from the Bronx into Queens and then through Brooklyn, the governor might look at that and say, like, well, I want to spend the money on upstate, prison construction because that's where my political base is, right? But if these were private companies developing the subways, then maybe what you could do is set up a system where, like, some kind of government-appointed board, like the Federal Reserve, or a collection of experts, I guess, would sit around and say, like, what do we need? And they would sort of like map out an outline of how they want the transportation in the region to look. And then those lines or those corridors or those rights of ways would be sort of publicly or privately developed.
Sure.
And those private companies would be sort of regulated, and they would be allowed to, sort of like a public utility right now, like an energy company. They're allowed to make a profit, but their finance, it's very much reviewed by the government, and they do have some control over what they're allowed to charge their customers. I think I would be comfortable with something like that. So I would say that, like, I think the Federal Reserve idea is a pretty interesting one in terms of how to manage this.
Okay. Ben, do you have any points you want to jump in, or I'll bring us to our last topic?
Sure. Let me see here. It's an intriguing idea. And I like where Jesse went with it. The only thing I would possibly add is that if you make something a private company, inevitably the usage and those who benefit from it are going to be the ones with money, and that brings us back to the equity point that we hit earlier. But I would like to see basically where I'm at with that is that this sounds like an interesting idea. I have no idea how that would work in practice, and like how would you appoint the board? How would people decide where things are going? That would end up being political as well. Like,
yeah, I mean, there's no way to divorce this from political
it's just
sense.
like,
it doesn't even make sense, like, as like an idea to divorce it from politics completely.
Can I throw something in your direction, Scott, real quick? We mentioned earlier in the show about self-driving cars. I have opinions on that. Do we want to talk about that at all, or
yeah?
Not?
So I guess we can use that as our last topic.
Unless you had something else to talk about, because it's mostly just like, I don't know. I just had opinions, and it sounds like we sort of it's that's sort of like put on the wayside and hasn't really come into the conversation at all. And I don't know if bringing that up would break us from this mold.
Yeah, I guess in terms of directions for it, I guess I'll just propose the two ideas, and then I guess the audience, you don't get to vote on this. It's not an interactive format. I don't really care. I don't want your opinions. But basically, the two places, or we could do both, it's sort of both of you have highlighted sort of this problem essentially that since the United States is a developed country in a certain aspect. Now, before people get like really upset about that, what I mean is that cities have already been built. They've been around for 100 years or more. It's hard to change things in those circumstances. So the cost of any transportation is like very high. So kind of addressing that issue and where you think we should go from there, or what to go about it, or we can kind of delve into the new hot technology, which is self-driving cars, and sort of what the role may or may not be, or if they'll happen.
I think going with the original plan is good. We can talk more about self-driving later if we feel like it.
Or
personally,
just to tease,
I don't know, Jesse.
To tease the audience. Maybe they'll have some episode. I don't know.
Yeah,
I'm
fine with whatever. I think that I guess that like one of the ways self-driving cars is in a certain sense like a way of dealing with this old infrastructure problem, right?
Sure.
Like, So I don't know. I'm happy to talk about both.
All right, so let's bring it to let's go into self-driving cars, because this is going to be, I mean, it's arguably a relevant topic in many capacities. It's going to have enormous economic implications as well. But
It's pretty sick.
we're going to focus on obviously its relation to infrastructure, and then we'll start off with you, Ben, and then I'll kind of move us forward.
Okay.
Or not.
So, basically, my thing with self-driving cars is to say I am skeptical of self-driving cars is to be putting it mildly, because from my opinion, the way I see self-driving cars is that is a new and mostly untested technology that people are looking forward to say like, oh, this new thing will solve all of our problems. When in the past that's happened and people said, oh, this new technology will solve all of our problems, and then it's not all that's cracked up to be. There's some problems, and like people who supported it before were just like, actually, never mind, we don't want this new thing. Go back to be scrapped. So that's one angle that I have on self-driving cars. Number two is it feels much more like a bandage than anything else. It feels like okay, you can make I feel the only issue that self-driving cars really solve, mind a big one, is the safety issue, because self-driving cars are safer than regular monkeys driving cars. Absolutely, 100%. I'm not debating that. There are very smart people working on these things. But outside of that, they don't really solve congestion unless you have a system where all of the cars on the road are self-driving cars, and they can all talk to each other that way. And that makes stuff much more efficient, because you don't need stoplights, because they can talk to each other and not going to run into each other, and like that. So like that's sort of one of those like self-driving cars just feels like. And also, there's the political aspect of it is what happens when something goes wrong with one of these cars. Who's to blame? Who picks up the cost? If a self-driving car kills someone through some sort of glitch in the system, who's to blame? Is it the people who built software? Is it the person who was in the car? Or if it was an unmanned car, like where, like where, what?
Yeah. Okay. So let's unpack that. So basically, we're seeing it from like a policy angle of like people, and rightfully so, like to have like an accountability in a sense, and then. And especially in transportation, it's pretty relevant, because with every transit disaster we've had in the United States, people are looking for like why this happened. So one of the big issues is sort of kind of to move you guys along is like where's the accountability model in any sort of self-driving car aspect, and then the efficiency thing is sort of the idea, and obviously you both can elaborate on this, but generally speaking, the pitched idea is that once self-driving cars become a popular model, then no one really should be driving, and that is in a sense the model. If enough of the cars are on the road, they can solve the congestion model, because a common one is the braking issue, which is just kind of if people don't know, like one of the general theories for why traffic occurs is people who don't necessarily know or are interested in why you get stuck on the road for 20 minutes doing nothing is because of the braking issue, where cars don't accurately or precisely brake, which then causes a snowball effect that makes other people just stop eventually. That's like a theory of kind of congestion and flow.
Yeah, there's a lot of good studies on that, and some good diagrams on how that works. So
yeah, and so that's like a proposed way that if there's enough of them, how they will solve sort of a congestion issue. And then your last point is that what was it that
accountability.
What was your third? You had 3 points, right?
It feels
well, let's just go ahead on these two.
I think the last one was talking about like how it's a new technology and people are looking to this to save them. Is that it?
Yeah, I mean, I think the big issue is the backpedaling issue, because people are going to expect too much from it necessarily, and I don't want to get too much into that just because that's not. I mean, it's like it's more of a psychology issue.
Yeah,
like
exactly.
Explaining politics to people issue versus like a policy, like an urban transportation policy issue.
Right.
Just, do you have any thoughts on the first two sort of?
Yeah. So the accountability and
the accountability model.
And what was the second?
The first is the accountability, and the second was sort of the how well it actually will address the congestion issue, because it is reliant on having many of these cars on the road, essentially.
Right. So I think it does. Well, I'm kind of going to think in sort of there's kind of like 3 stages of self-driving car, I guess, if you want to like, right? There's like what we have now, which is basically no self-driving cars, all human driven.
Yep.
And we're probably going to enter this transition period
Like
within
a hybrid, like some percentage of self-driving cars, some percentage of people driving.
right. And that's going to probably, I don't know, that might be like 20, 30 years of that. But I do think eventually the technology will be such that people either won't want to drive or won't be allowed to. But that's half a lifetime away. I would say in the short term, I think I do see a lot of benefit to it. And I agree that it's pretty intensely hyped. But I think this is a situation where we will see a major shift because that'll be sort of sustained because I think there's a confluence of factors going on here. Ben mentioned the safety issue, which I think is probably the first and most compelling reason for self-driving car adoption, which is that people get distracted, they get angry, and the computers will make mistakes too, but the mistakes will be correctable. You can't correct for somebody getting angry. That's not like you can't correct for the population having angry individuals in it, right? So yeah. I think we have problems as humans that make us, when we get into a metal box and drive it at 60 miles an hour, we just not built for that, and a computer will be better. So I think that's true, and I think that'll be a benefit we can look at. And I think that winds up, working with this sort of efficiency and this, in some cases, environmental goal, which is, if cars can sort of drive themselves to where they're needed, then we don't need to have parking lots filled with unused cars waiting for their owners to come back to them, right? We can actually theoretically reduce the total number of cars very significantly to the point where we only have as many cars as are necessary at the highest peak point, which is still probably a lot, but not every car is being driven even during rush hour. We often have, a large portion of our fleet just basically idle, right? Mm-hmm. And so I think that there are like big environmental and economic concerns that make that, in addition to the safety, that make it sort of like it ties our hands. Like I think self-driving cars is going to be, but I also see that there are some I think self-driving cars are going to happen. I think they're going to benefit us in a lot of ways. I do think that as it goes along, we're going to find some issues. I think people, viewed previous transportation technologies with the same kind of excitement as we now are looking at self-driving cars. I think that's probably part of the reason why, originally it was like maybe canals, let's say, right? So in New York, because it's an old city during like the canal steamboat era, we have tons of these canals that, we have tons of these canals that now are basically just like toxic sludge, totally polluted, disgusting areas that kind of snake through the city and divide up the grid. With the railroad, we built like so many miles of railroad that like a lot of, I'm sure anyone who's lived out in sort of a suburb or countryside, there's abandoned railroads kind of all over the place these days. Highways, if you go out to Iowa, you'll almost never see these interstates full, and we have 8-lane highways running through basically depopulated states. So we've always gotten very excited about transportation. Seems to me an industry that gets it easily lends itself to fads and bubbles. So I think we're definitely going to see that in self-driving cars. But again, I think that the benefits here will be a relief to a lot of the pressing issues we have now with transportation, which is again like safety and the fact that we have a tremendous number of cars on the road and a tremendous number of vehicles just idling in parking lots and things like this. So sure. I don't know. I'm pretty hopeful for self-driving cars. I would say that I think then I would say that I'm probably, in my opinion, the right amount of skeptical, but I think I'm a little bit more excited for it than maybe the average person. I don't know.
Can I bring something in here
yeah,
that I felt like I was dancing around? how much do you think, Jesse, that self-driving cars, like I said, it's like abandoned to what we have.
Right.
How much do you feel like? I feel there's a very real potential that the politicians and such, because politicians are notorious for running with fads terribly. So how much do you feel that the pushing of self-driving cars will end us in a place where we use self-driving cars to the detriment of some other form of transportation that would be so much cheaper and so much more efficient? So, for example, we build this big highway for self-driving cars to run people from point A to point B. That's like a big commuter area where really what you could do there is just have a big giant train that moves a lot more people with a lot less energy. How much do you feel like that's another one of the reasons I'm skeptical about it? And like, what do you think of them from that angle?
I think that's a very fair. I think that is the problem that is likely if we have if this is another catastrophe of transportation, which I would argue like the highway era in some ways was, that's will be how it unfolds. So I think that that's the right thing to be worried about. My hope would be though, and this is kind of funny because generally I'm not a huge fan of the way Uber conducts its business, but if I
wasn't going to mention that.
Yeah, but if I envision a model like Uber, right, where you have your phone, you call it comes, and it's a self-driving car. It comes up to you, you get in, it takes you where you're going, right? My hope would be, and there may be some political considerations here, is that people would sort of naturally find these efficient things on their own. So what I feel like self-driving cars or just more responsive sort of taxi, like non-ownership services in general allows is like, let's say I don't live in an area that has public transportation, but or let's say I live in right outside of in a suburb right outside of like a city that has like a really great transportation network. Maybe where I used to just get in my car and drive it all the way into the center of the city to get to work, park it, and then drive back. Maybe when I have sort of self-driving vehicles, I will feel okay to take the public transit because I know that there will be a car waiting for me to get to the last mile, get back to my house. So I think what I would hope for is that the self-driving cars will highlight the economic benefits of like getting on the more efficient, train line. Whereas right now, like if I start driving my car, even if there's a train line that runs most of my journey, I might not take it just because I want my car to be there when I'm done, and I don't want to have to like walk in the rain, and like there's all these considerations. There's a lot of
human factors that will make people gravitate towards their personal convenience over what's the actual most effective way of moving around.
Right, and I might be wrong. Like maybe once somebody gets in the self-driving car, they just want to be in that one self-driving car just as badly as they want to be in their own car.
It's a big thing with personal, like cars in general. Like you just kind of want to be in your box.
I don't know exactly how that like preference is gonna work out, but I mean, my hope is that my hope is that when instead of building the self-driving car superhighway, we build a train line. And people and have a space for the cars to drop people and build it with self-driving cars in mind so that it makes sense for people for the car to like pull up or something in a safe way and like drop people right off at the train, like try to make that transition between modes very seamless. I think that would be like how we could do self-driving cars like very well. Sure. But I could also see it going the way, Ben, you were describing, where people sort of adopt the attitudes they have of private vehicles, like private car use, and apply it to a self-driving car. Then there's always an opportunity for bad allocation of resources.
Sure.
Yeah, I'm just gonna follow up and say that I do agree with you that the last mile issue as far as public transportation is concerned is like a big thing that I feel that I definitely agree with you there, that it can self-driving cars and that sort of system you talked about at the end there is something that would be a definite benefit to the way that transit is done in America. So anyway,
kind of pushing us along into our final topic. Both of you are we started with this issue and it's kind of been tying in a bunch, but basically Do you have any ideas of what we can do better to address the fact that building anything in established cities is insanely expensive, and that these cities do desperately need to start expanding their public transits because they're growing, their populations are growing. For the first time in the United States history, more people live in cities than the countryside. Is that correct? I'm pretty sure I'm right on that. If it's not, well,
it's a trend. It's a trend.
In the world,
yeah,
more people now live in cities. Yeah.
Right. So, and then all these cities, and a lot of these cities are very old. So there's always the issue of how are we going to basically build infrastructure to match the growing population, and kind of the basic solutions we've covered are like just like digging up roads, which no one likes because it's super inconvenient. Using eminent domain, which if anyone knows the history of that, has had a lot of problems and just not politically popular, let alone all the bad things it's done. It's just not, and it rightfully probably shouldn't be politically popular.
Right.
Kind of, I'll throw it off to Ben, but where do you see us kind of going in the future? Because most cities have this problem right now that it's really hard, expensive to build anything new. And what are better methodologies we could do that? I mean, part of it, you could just have the opinion of tell people to suck it up, like, want better stuff. You gotta like sit there and deal with it, you know. That's the authoritarian model. I don't think most Americans will like that, but you know, knowing the history of some other places, that is a very efficient model. It's not a great model. It's pretty mean. Has a lot of long-term consequences. But yes, but as a serious point, like, where do you think we should go from here? Because this is a challenge that every city will face.
Okay. So I think at the thing that we're going to be wanting to go towards as populations in cities become denser is we're going to be wanting to look at transportation systems that minimize the number of vehicle-like things moving around. This can be trains, buses, etc. And part of the way I think you can get there is you can start from the densest part of the city, so Minnesota, the two downtown areas, and sort of, well, the first step would be build systems to get people into the city without using their car, make it really easy to get there.
So that's where you want to load up the expense right now to hopefully
just like,
pay for in the future. Okay.
Yep, trains, buses, whatever. Make it really easy for someone to just like to get to the center of the metropolitan area without having to drive their car. And that will have the effect of it'll reduce the number of cars in the downtown area, and thus you need fewer roads in the downtown area. Therefore, you can start tearing up roads and start building out some transit systems and start making the city much more walkable and much safer for people. I'm sort of pulling from my experience in New York, specifically Spain, but the whole of Europe has this sort of similar sort of idea, where in the cities, pedestrians are the people that the city is built for. Like you get around in the city by walking or taking a subway or a bus or whatever. And the cars, they are the guests. Like you'll see the car, if they want to go through the city, they have to drive really slowly because they're sharing pedestrian walkways.
Right, it's considered more of a luxury item is another way of phrasing that. Exactly. Just to give other people context, or if you're from other parts of the world, some places have car taxes. Hong Kong and Singapore have like permits that are required to use one. They're very expensive. These are ways to reduce cars on the road, and it becomes a luxury item. Just to give context to people who may not know that, or if you already are used to that.
No, I don't want to say we want to go fully to a European model where we like tax cars and etc. But I think getting to that, using that sort of idea where in the city, pedestrians are the residents and cars are the guests, can move a long way, get us a long way towards making a transit system that is much more efficient and much more much better for our country in general. Okay. And of course, once you start in the metro area, then you can sort of build out from there, and as far as you need to go.
Right. So to tie that back, the idea there is that you're going to factor in cost essentially by basically incentivizing the use of sort of nexus style transit where you're bringing people in. You'll basically lower the value of just all the random roads and all that property there, so people won't care if it's dug up.
Yeah,
some capacity. Exactly. Okay. Do you have any other?
Yeah. I'm not sure, and like as far as cost is concerned, like building new lines and stuff, I'm not sure how much this would affect that cost. Sure. But I do feel the lack of roads, because cars are big boxes that need a lot of space to move around in. If you don't have to worry about cars when you're building, you can just direct people as like, hey, go around this detour thing, and you don't really have to leave a lot of space for people to walk. I don't know if that's like, I don't know if that's gonna lower costs, but like my intuition says that if you don't have to worry about tearing up roads, or if you don't have to worry about leaving the roads intact, like you said, the New York model where you build a subway that's like 3,000 feet underground, you can then that cost gets reduced a bit.
Or there's a lower political cost.
Lower political cost as well.
Sure.
Yes.
Okay, so then moving on to Jesse, do you have? I guess to kind of bring you in here.
Yeah. I think that's definitely the. I think that there's an element where like we definitely need to just, our projects are kind of over engineered. We tend to have like a big transit idea rather than small transit ideas.
Sure.
But like I think what Ben's point was very well taken. That like the big problem is like we don't want to tear up the streets because the cars are the privileged class of commuter. We will. I mean, like I see this New York City. Less than 50% of the people own a car, and cars are still like the king, right? Like anytime they need to do work underground, they'll try to preserve as many lanes of car traffic as possible, but they'll shut down that side of the sidewalk. And it could even be the case that vastly more people use that sidewalk than that lane that they're trying to preserve, but they'll preserve the lane sort of, I guess, kind of instinctively. I think that's something we need to work around. The problem, I think, there is that it needs to be coupled with some kind of congestion pricing. So, like, I think we've talked a bunch about like subsidies and how the pricing of different modes of transportation can be kind of strange. I guess this is the first time we bring it up, but like time pricing can be very important here without sort of any, I mean, it would require a little bit of infrastructure, but mostly it's a way of raising revenue and reducing this car overload problem, where sort of cars would be charged a fee to enter the city during certain times, namely during rush hours. I think that would be one way of, reducing this need to keep all those lanes of traffic, because the reason they need to keep all the lanes of traffic open is for rush hour. In almost every city, right? Rush hour is going to be the peak load, and that's what they're always sort of engineering for. I think that I think congestion pricing is a great way of sort of, as what we were talking about, equalizing the financial situation of a lot of these different transit modes, taking back some of that subsidy from the cars a little bit, and applying it in a way that allows us to build public transit projects cheaper because we no longer need as many roads now that there are fewer cars during rush hour. So I think that would be sort of my like politically feasible approach. I would say like congestion pricing, and then maybe build the subway a little bit closer to the street and tear out a few more lanes. That's sort of the kind of adjustment that it's honestly like, it seems so trivial to just say that, but if that were the case in most American cities, I think you'd see a lot more work getting done. It would be a lot cheaper to build transit, and just generally, we would do away with a lot of the really problematic aspects of having so many cars running around all the time and so much parking space and things like that. One other thing I would like to add that we've sort of avoided, or we've kind of danced around, is that land use is really important here when we're talking about transportation. So zoning goes into that, density restrictions or density requirements, parking restrictions, parking requirements. These are all placed not necessarily on anything related to transit proper, but this is how we require buildings on it. And that in turn, develops our needs for transit. And so I think there could be a lot of interesting work done on the planning side. I am generally a fan of zoning. I think that I think that zoning is used for both good and bad. And I think we need to have sort of I don't have a suggestion on this because it's not really my major focus, but I think there really needs to be, in the same way we need sort of a systematic approach to saying like, is this project valuable? How valuable is it? I think we need to do the same thing with land use, and we need to say, what zoning what zoning laws are valuable and which aren't. Because in some cities you'll have zoning laws that a lot of people would really like that sort of prevent buildings from being built too high. But on the other hand, that also encourages really expensive, housing, right? It creates restricts the supply, so the value of housing
restricts
goes.
the supply of housing, and
at the same time,
space as well.
Right, and that happens again, like in the suburbs too. Except it'll generally be more extreme. So it'll say, you can only have one house, and it can only be this big, and you need to have a lot that's like 10 times the size of your house. So even if that area lent itself to transportation, maybe it was a great place to build a train line. If you can't build any apartment buildings next to the train line, then you don't really solve the problem of everyone still needing a car. So, I would say, I think going forward, congestion pricing is really important. I would say that we need to, sort of less engineer or no longer tailor our transportation projects to convenient cars as little as possible. I think we need to start, sharing the burden a little bit more equally in terms of disruption. And then I would say we need to think about land use as a factor in transportation.
Right, as a factor to the pricing and how it'll kind of shape up in the future.
I'm going to add something real quick here. I've actually consciously been avoiding the zoning question this entire time. So I'm glad you brought it up, and I just want to say I agree with you. Zoning is a very powerful tool, but it can be abused. But if we're going to make a better transportation system in America, zoning will definitely be
You'll need to leverage zoning for the future.
That tool will need to be used, absolutely.
Sure, okay. And that makes sense as a way to because basically by controlling the land use, you will have a method for which you can A, make stuff happen, and B, in a certain sense, kind of keep the pricing and control that without having it just spiral out of control because the land is either occupied or privileged to the car, etc.
Right.
Yeah, so I guess that's the end of it. Do you guys? I'll start with Ben. Do you have anyone shout outs? You don't have sponsors because that's not how this works. Do you have any shout outs you want to give? Anyone you want to plug before we end?
I shout out to my sponsors. Not really. I mean, I guess I'll just plug my Twitter at MasterTierAgent. If you want to follow me there, go right ahead. I'm sort of active, but work in politics in Minnesota. If you have any questions about policies in Minnesota, you can always hit me up in Twitter. I will definitely be available to answer any questions anyone has. Okay.
Jesse, do you have anything else? Or a closing remark? Do you have a closing remark? Anything you want, like a takeaway? Do you have anything like that? Or did you, I assume it's been a long episode. Yeah. So.
I don't know. I don't want to beat a dead horse, but I don't know. My name is Jesse. You can follow me on Twitter at SuperJesseH. I'm in the New York area doing sort of technology, transportation, weird urban stuff.
All right.
And I guess if there was a shout out, if I could give a shout out, I would give it to the Second Avenue Subways blog, Second Avenue Sagas, actually. Highly recommend if you're in the New York area or anywhere. That's a great site just for sort of regular updates on the nonsense that is the politics in our transit system. So
interesting. I guess I can give a shout out to myself, but I'm not going to. I already know what I've done to make this happen. So that's the end of the show. Bye, everyone.
All right.